Hi, my name is Linda Eld, and I've been knitting for many, many years. I think my grandma taught me how to knit, how to make a purl stitch, and how to cast on. I was a very young girl. I was maybe 6 or 7 years old, but did I know what I was doing that whole time? No. And obviously, as a little girl, I didn't even know the right questions to ask. And so I've done a lot of knitting over the years. Some of it's been successful and some of it wasn't. And I realize when it wasn't successful, it's because it's what I didn't know that caused me to not be successful. So I decided that I want to share what I've learned through these tutorials. And hopefully it will get you started out in the right direction, or maybe you've knitted for a number of years and you still go into a yarn store and you look around and you think, oh my goodness, I don't even know which yarn I should be looking for. It can be very confusing. So in the next few tutorials, I hope to answer some of those questions. I hope to get you started out right and set up for success. And I just want to say, there's a number of ways to knit. Every country has a little bit different method all around the world. And in the end, it all comes out into a knitted project. So I'm just going to teach you my way. I'm not going to say it's the only way, because it certainly isn't. I think it's a pretty good way when I compare it to some other methods, but we'll talk about that throughout the tutorials. So this is my experience. This is what I've learned, and I just want to share it with you. So even if you've knitted and you just need some refresher courses, or maybe looking for some answers, hopefully we can have that happen here in these tutorials. If you have questions along the way, please message me, leave a comment, and I will certainly try to answer to the best of my ability. Anyhow, I hope you enjoy these tutorials. I'm not even going to say how many there are. We'll see when we get there. Okay, let's get started with our first tutorial on So You Want to Knit. Let's just call it that. And what do we need to know? Well, there's several things that will be helpful for you to know. First of all, I'll give you a little visual of what we're going to knit. I know often a person thinks when they start to knit, oh, well, I'll knit a hat, or I'll knit a scarf. Well, I think that kind of sets you up for failure. So when I've thought about this, it's like, how can I help you be successful and learn to knit the correct way? So these tutorials are going to focus on knitting correctly so that when you do start a project, you'll have everything set up in your favor. So I'm just showing you this. This is a, how many inches here? This is probably about a 6 by 5 little square, and you think, well, that's not much. But we're going to learn a lot about this little square. And this little square is going to teach you a lot, and you'll be making a number of little squares before we really even get into making a hat. But when you do get around to making that hat, it's going to be a great hat. It's going to be very successful. So what are the tools you need to get started for this tutorial? Well, we know we are going to need a knitting needle. Pretty obvious. Years ago, I gave up my straight needles, and I work exclusively with what's called a circular needle. A straight needle would just be, an extension of this metal part without this cable. So if you just envision this, ended right here, broken in the middle, and this can all be metal, that would be a straight needle. But I've enjoy so much working on the circular. So these circular needles work everywhere that a straight needle would work. And there's some additional adaptive needles on down the road that we'll talk about. But so you're going to need a needle. Now, if you have some needles, be they circular needles or straight needles, to begin with, work with what you have if they are even close to the correct size. So you need a needle. This happens to be a size 6 needle. So this little gauge right here is a pretty important little thing to have, because you may not know any longer, if you're like me, maybe you didn't keep the wrapper this came out of. So the nice thing about this little gauge is I know it's a size 6 needle. If I put it in the size 5 slot, it doesn't go in. It goes in nicely in the size 6. So I know this is a US size 6 needle. So that's how I know what size needle to work with. Now, I will suggest, and we're going to talk about yarn in a second, select a needle that is around a 5, 6, 7, maybe an 8, probably not much bigger than that. But to begin with, for this class, you want a size needle that's going to be pretty easy to get a hold of. Be kind to your hands and don't go down to a real fine like a 1 or a 2. Don't do that. Now, yarn. What would we choose for yarn? Well, first of all, I'm going to suggest use what yarn you have if you have some yarn. If not, and you need to go buy a skein of yarn for this tutorial, do not go buy expensive yarn. I don't care what blend it is. You know, a wool blend is fine. It can be 100% wool. It can be 100% acrylic. The only thing I'm going to caution you with that is, and now we're going to talk about some different twists in yarn and the up and down side. If you already have yarn, you're going to work with what you have, but let me show you some differences in yarn. I've chosen a yarn here that I would not suggest you get. How's that for a great tutorial? But I'm going to twist in the opposite direction. Do you see what I'm seeing as I twist? That yarn starts to separate pretty easily. I only had to give it about a half, maybe a full twist, and it started to separate. That, if you have that kind of yarn, go ahead and work with it, but don't be surprised if it doesn't split on you while you're knitting. And that can be a little frustrating. So if you have a choice to go out and buy a yarn, there's 2 yarns I'm going to recommend. This is what's called a DK weight, and you can see with this, it's a pretty tight twist. It takes quite a bit of twisting to get that to separate. It's got enough wool in it, it holds together. That's what you want. This is a DK weight. That will be very good for these tutorials. We'll advance on to some other yarns in future tutorials. But to begin with, to have the nicest, best yarn to work with, this is what I'm going to recommend. Either a DK weight that has a good twist to it. This is a heavier weight. It's called Arian, and I can twist it and I can actually make it kind of come untwisted, but you can't see light. It's pretty stickery. It doesn't untwist easily. And what that means when you're knitting with it, it's not going to do what we call split on you. So I'm just trying to help you have the best success. If you're going to go buy a yarn, buy something that has a nice twist to it, a tight twist. This is what I consider a looser twist. Get it down here, and you can see it starts to split real easily. I don't know if that's showing up real well, but just look for that. You can go to the big box store and buy a yarn that's not real expensive. Please don't go and buy expensive yarn. You could even go to Goodwill and maybe find some yarn, and it can be 100% acrylic. For this project, we don't care. You will find I am very particular about yarn that I'm working with for a garment, and other than socks, I seldom want a blend that's got any acrylic in it. Socks, having a little nylon in it helps hold its structure, but for this, we just want a yarn. If you're buying one, buy one like these that have a nice twist to them, tight, that doesn't untwist easily. I would suggest color. The lighter the color, the easier you're going to see your stitches. Now this white with a speck in it is the same yarn as this orange, and it's just some leftover that I had, and so I'm working with it. I'm not going out and buying some expensive yarn for these tutorials, because this is all practice and you don't need to spend lots of money. So the next thing we're going to talk about, we've talked about we need needles, we need some yarn, and we don't need a full big skein, because, you know, if you've got some ends and odds and ends, we can use them up in these little squares that we're going to make. But the next thing we're going to talk about is the label on the yarn. And I know I still sometimes get overwhelmed when I go into a good yarn store, and usually when I'm shopping, I like to be independent and just kind of snoop on my own, especially if I'm clothes shopping. But often in a yarn store, when the clerk comes up and asks if they can help, and they usually do, I find their help very, very valuable, even as many years as I've knitted. I like to tell them what it is that I'm looking to make, and they know their yarn. They know what they have on the shelf, and they can steer you to the correct yarn. That's the one time, especially in a yarn store, take the help. So this particular sleeve came off of this yarn here. This is an Arian weight, which is a heavier weight yarn. And I just want to show you that on the sleeve, there is valuable information here. I get it too close to the camera and then you can't see it. So it tells us worsted weight, talks about what kind of twist it has, worsted weight. It has 140 yards. It also tells me that it's 4.5 to 5 stitches per inch if you're using a size 7 needle. You will find that knitting uses a lot of math. Fortunately, it's, you know, simple addition and a little bit of 4 times however many inches long you want something. So it's pretty simple math, but there is a lot of math used in knitting, especially when you get into making a garment. So learn to read the sleeve. This also tells me that it was spun in Harrisville, New Hampshire, which is kind of fun to see that. The source, which is the wool, actually came off of sheep from Wyoming, and it was dyed in Pennsylvania. So this particular yarn is all made, raised, dyed, totally processed here in the United States. That's kind of fun to know. So that's about the sleeve. You'd want to start learning to read the tag, the label, whatever you want to call it, that's on the yarn. This little sleeve came off of this DK weight. This happens to be a blend of silk, merino wool, and alpaca. And it's a DK weight, which means it's a little lighter weight than the Arian. And the suggested needle size is a 5 or 6 US, where the other one was a 7. The suggested is a size 6. And that's what I'm going to be working with. I'm going to be working with this size 6 right here. I'm not going to be using this yarn here, is too dark in color. So if you're going to go out and buy a yarn for this project, for this class, get yourself a lighter color. This, I wouldn't go much darker than what this green is right here. You will appreciate that. I'm going to actually use this white, and my sample, of course, was this bright orange. It's just easier to see. If you go to a really dark color, it's hard to see your stitches. And remember, I'm trying to set you up for success. So now we've talked about needles, we've talked about our yarn, and that's really all you need to get started on this tutorial. And of course, the first thing we have to learn is how to get the stitches on this needle. How do we get started? That's called casting on. And that's a term that you will want to remember. You will start seeing it in knitting patterns. And there's several ways to cast on. I'm going to show you 2, and I will tell you which one is my favorite. Now, some people just get in a hurry and they think, well, casting on is just getting some stitches on the needle so then you can begin knitting. But this is your foundation piece. Years ago, we used to build houses, and you know, you start with, you have to prepare the soil, you have to grade it out, and then your foundation is the number one thing you start with. And if that foundation is off, it's going to be off forever. It's never going to correct itself, and it's going to influence how the rest of the house is built. Well, that's the way it is with casting on. That is your foundation, and you're going to create habits right in the very beginning. And I want to see you create good habits, and I think it will be helpful if you understand why. Being very, very specific about how you cast on, what is your tension, and we're going to learn more about that word tension, why that is so important. And so we're going to take our time with it. So the first one that I'm going to show you is called long tail cast on. And we're going to make a long tail. We're just going to pull some yarn here, and the tail part is going to be facing towards me. It's on this side, and the ball is going to be over here. And that's important to have it facing that way. Otherwise, you'll run out of yarn in your long tail over here before you get very many stitches on. So very first thing we're going to do is, remember those old games we used to play with string art? Well, this kind of, it reminds me of that. And so we're going to put it over our thumb and our index finger. I'm right-handed. For those of you that are left-handed, I'm sure you're used to watching something and having to adapt it. So I can't help you with that, but I do appreciate your circumstances. So we're just gonna put our needle through there, put the yarn over the top of the needle. I'm gonna actually put my finger on top of that little piece right there, and I'm gonna pull it back here. Now, some people put a slip knot there. You can, it isn't necessary. But I'm just going to do it, hold it with my finger, and I'm going to come over here and I'm going to go under that yarn that comes around my thumb. I'm going to go under that. I'm going to come over, catch this side here, and pull it through the hole where my thumb is. And then I'm going to rock it down, and look at, we've got 2 stitches just like that on our needle. So now let's do that again. So here's I'm going to pick this up, move my hand so you can see what I'm doing here. So I'm going to put my 2 fingers between the 2 pieces of yarn that are on my needle. I'm going to hold it with my finger a little bit yet. I'm going to go up under this outer piece of yarn right here. I'm going to go over the top of the piece that's around my index finger, and I'm going to pull it through that hole. Rock it. And when I rock it here back and forth, I'm just tightening it up a little bit, and I say that with, I don't want you to pick up on the word tight. I'm just taking out some of the slack. You do not want to pull this tight. You don't want loose, gapey stitches there, but you want it to slide. If it's not sliding, you're pulling your yarn too tight. So let's do this again. We're going to come over here, pick up from underneath the outer loop that's around the thumb, come over, pick up this top piece that went around the index finger, come back through the hole by the thumb, slip your fingers out and just kind of spread that apart. Okay, now we have 4 stitches on our needle. And honestly, you start doing this and you can start doing it really fast. Now, fast is not necessarily best. You want the same tension on all of these stitches. If it doesn't slide easily like this, you're pulling your yarn too tight. I want to show you something about yarn. So I'm just holding it without any tension on it. I'm going to put this orange piece down here because that might make this show up better. Hope this shows up. This is relaxed. The yarn, it's holding it straight, but it's relaxed. But when I pull on each end, see, there's movement there. It's kind of elastic. So if you're casting on to the point that you're pulling that elastic in that yarn, you're in trouble before you ever start knitting. So you'll not be able to get your needle in these stitches here. So you do not want to distort your yarn when you cast it on. You want the yarn to be in the relaxed state here. So let's do a few more of those. Come under the thumb yarn, go over the index finger yarn and pull that through the thumb hole and rock it back and forth till you get it up there, but you've left so there's just enough tension that it's not sloppy. This is what it looks from the underneath side. You don't want any big loops there, but you want this yarn to be in its relaxed state, not stretched out. So we're going to do a few more of those. So I'm going under the outside piece of yarn that comes around the outside edge. I'm picking that up from underneath. I'm going over the top here of the index finger and rocking it into place. That's the long tail cast on. And so for this piece right here, I cast on a total of 35 stitches. So that's what we're aiming for, is 35 stitches. Now I'm going to show you another cast on that I like even better, and I use most of the time. I will say this cast on works. It's beautiful. I've used it for years. If you're making something that you don't want to have a lot of extra give to the like if you were making a pair of socks, this might be kind of tight. The knitted on cast on is one that I like better, especially if you're doing like a ribbing for a pair of socks or the ribbing around a hat, or even if you just want the outside edge of the hat, the headband part, to have a little give. The knitted on cast on, I think, is better because it has a little bit more give to it. This has a little more structure to it. So we're going to take that off, and if you're casting on whichever method you're doing, I just suggest pull it off and do it several times. The goal is not just to get some loops on your needle, but remember, you're building the foundation. You want these stitches to be the very best you can make. So learning to cast on correctly, evenly, without too much tension is very important. You'll hear me say a number of times that really knitting is a lot like baking bread. You know, you have to do it a number of times to get it right and to get a feel for it. And I think knitting has a lot to do with feel. You have to get a feel for it. And the only way you're going to accomplish that is do a lot of knitting. And so why not do it in small little projects like this? Than if you thought this was a scarf, was to be a scarf, and think of knitting at 5 feet long so it would wrap around. That's a lot of just straight knitting, and afterwards you look at it and say, oh my gosh, I'll never wear that. So these little sample squares, these will be in a little sample book someday for you that you can always refer back to. So I like this idea of making little sample squares. That's what we're going to be making, a number of those, with different designs. So now we are going to do the knit on cast on method, and here I make a little slip knot. And to make a slip knot's pretty easy. Come around, make a little circle. Your tail over here I put on the underneath side, slip my needle under it, take a hold of both ends and pull up, taking the slack out of that, but it can glide. Now I will say I like working with metal needles. There's times that I do work with wood needles. They're not quite as slick, and sometimes if a yarn is real slick, I work with a wood needle. So whether you have metal needle or wood needle for this beginning project, either will work. You work with what you maybe already have. Don't go out and spend a lot of money. If you're going to go and buy a needle, buy a good needle, because you'll be starting to build your needle collection. But if you have some needles already, then use what you have. Or if you don't want to, if you're just maybe experimenting to see if you like to knit, I can understand, you know, not spending a lot of money, but Addie is the brand that I really like. And if you go, you'll not see the Addie brand in the big box stores, but you will see them in knit shops. Okay, so we have our slip knot on here. I'm going to show you once again how I think probably everybody knows how to make a slip knot, but I shouldn't assume that, should I? So here's our made that circle, laid my tail right under the circle, put my needle through it, and now I'm going to pull it, and there's my slip knot. That's we'll see how easy that comes off. No worry, we'll just stick the needle right back in there. Now we're ready to knit. So if you noticed, left hand, my point of my needle is pointing out here to the right, and the next thing you have to learn to do is how to, what we call, pick up your yarn. Hold it in your left hand. So I wrap it around my little finger, come back up, go over the next, under the middle finger, over the index finger, and I use my thumb I hold my stitch I just made. The rest of my fingers are holding my knitting needle. So we're going to go over that several times. You say, well, why is that so important? Because this right here is your tension. It's what we call tension. And there has to be tension on there for you to be able to get a hold of this piece of yarn and pull it through the stitch that's right here. If this is loose this way, you're not going to be able to work with it. So you'll see crocheters do this also. So you have to get this tension. I do this so fast anymore that I have to stop and think about it now, explaining it to you. So here's our yarn laying right here. Here's my needle. I'm going to come with my hand and I'm picking up that yarn, going over the top of my little finger, over the top, under my little finger, over the top of the next finger, under my middle finger, and over the top of my index finger. So my index finger really is the one controlling most of the tension right here. Now, I could have this way too tight too. Remember what I said about pulling on this yarn and stretching out the elasticity in the yarn. You don't want to do that. You don't want to have this so tight that that yarn is like a violin fiddle string. You don't want that. You want to hold it. You want to have enough tension that it's not loosey-loop, but you don't want to have too much tension. You're going to do this over and over until it feels comfortable in your hand. Don't be too anxious to go on to the next step until you have figured out how to hold this yarn correctly. Now in our right hand, we have the right side, the right end of our needle. This is our left side, this is our right side. And we're going to cast on stitches, and it's going to be very much like knitting. So you're going to learn a couple things. You're going to learn how to actually do a knit stitch along with casting on, knitting it onto the needle. So we're going to take our right tip and we're going to, notice I have my middle finger holding right here, putting tension up against that. And I just slipped that needle right in that stitch in the back that's on the left needle. And I'm going to bring it up and catch. I just wrapped it around that, made a loop, and I'm going to pull it through. Now I have a stitch over here on my right needle, and I have a stitch on my left needle, and I'm going to actually put the one that was on the right over to the left. We've just cast on another stitch. Now we have 2 stitches there. Keeping my tension the same here the whole time. It's not super tight, but it's there. It's holding it. It's not letting it droop. So once again, with my middle finger and my thumb, I'm holding these stitches right here, or else they'd all fall off. My needle would fall down, so you have to hold on to it. Again, I'm going to take my right tip, put it into the back side of this needle. It's a little fiddly when you just got a couple of stitches on here. It will get easier. Okay, so right point of my needle went in the back side of the stitch that we had just made, wrap it around. I'm going to come under it and pull it through. And notice I'm using this thumb to help guide also. I've got it on my right needle, and I need to transfer it over here to my left needle. Can pull that out, and now we have 3 stitches. Let's do that again. Still holding with my thumb and my middle finger here. Put my point of my right needle into the back. come under and pull it through. The stitch is on my right needle. I'm going to transfer it over to my left needle. And now we have 4 stitches. And just automatically, I kind of pull as I'm doing it, that tension. But notice this slides easy. If you get this tight where it's, then pull it all off and start all over again. Once it's too tight, you're not going to correct it. Your foundation will be off. And doing it over and over again is really good practice. So we're going to make another stitch. Right point of the needle, I'm putting into the back side of that stitch, coming up under, wrap it around, pull it through. It's on my right needle. Now I'm going to transfer it over to my left needle. I'm going to put this back down here to see if that kind of helps you. The white background might not be the best. So now we can count our stitches. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's do that again. Put the point of this needle into the back side. Now this is where I want to talk to you again about the yarn that's twisted. This will split easily. I'm using it because I have it rather than go out and buy some other yarn. But it's easy for me to, there, I did that on purpose. So I'm only getting one little piece of this stitch, right? So you have to be careful. If you've got some yarn that's not have a very tight twist, you can get just a portion rather than getting through the actual loop. So got my right needle in there, come under, over, pull it through. There's another stitch, transfer it from the right over to the left. Notice I use this to help me make the tension like it should be. Your hands just start working automatically together and it becomes really easy. And once you get going, you don't even have to take the stitch, the needle out. You can leave the needle here and we're ready to go for another one. This is such a slick way to get cast on. Now I know that was a little fast for you to see, so we're going to start this all over again so you can kind of get an idea. But notice the tension, other than this one out here at the very end, is a little bit looser. I fixed that. I just pulled this knot up a little tighter. You want the tension along here to be all the same. That shows you what the back side's going to look like. That's casting on. So we're going to finish casting on and then I'll show you how we start knitting. So we're going to cast on 35 stitches. Now if you need to stop the video and go back and just work on that front part, do that. Because learning that cast on, and I don't care if you do the long tail cast on or if you do this knitted cast on, this just happens to be my favorite and I use it for so many things. You can choose which one you do. Either one will work. So get that done, get your 35 stitches on, and then come back and I'll show you what we're going to do after we get the 35 stitches on.